sun's coming up. I wanted to read that before the sun came up. I'm just gonna be gross, I guess. So I'm not in the mood. Follow me to ground. The summers here are made of long, untended grass and flat lemon light. Bacon ground, sunshine haze, shadows cast so dark and deep they seem as solid and alive as the bodies that throw them. The summers here have seen the morning sharp with heat, and every morning I leave the hot mess of my sheets to stand outside on the patio, stones, and study the drain, this gutted hole. Even now it sparkles with its secret wet supply. I'm fearful of it, the drain, fearful because no matter how long and dry the summer, slugs come up the drain and creep on their snake bellies round the patio, trying to get in the house. I've hated slugs since I was a child. Once I pinched one between my forefinger and thumb and rubbed it to death. It was a baby, no larger than a bean. At night, I hear their slow procession, all the slugs that live beneath the house, and I hear them moving around, shriveling over the pebbles and dirt like the skin on stalling fruit. Wandering blindly up and down the lawn, stalk eyes roving. Now in the daytime, the garden is all rustle and sigh, and I can't hear whatever sounds their lit bellies might be making. I see one, its blind snout appearing, a thumb-sized black snake departing the rim of the cracked drain's edge. It heads for the dry grass that sits like crust overcooked. Around the lush innards of the lawn. If Father were here, he'd scatter salt, he'd pour it down the drain. If I'd the stomach for the sizzle and stink their 1,000 corpses would make, I'd do the same. Father didn't hate slugs, but he was wary of them. Liquid and solid, they're neither one thing nor the other, and they take their time in coming. It's fitting, I suppose, that I should be tracking one today, this day that sees a long wait come to a close, because the ground is moving. For the first time in all these long, pale years, it's moving, it's finished, it's done. Nearby, the lavender grown in a heap has had its scent worn away. Such is the way in this heat. Little keeps, little that is above ground. Father was always more creaturely than me. There were nights when he let his spine loosen and go running on all fours through the woods, leaving sense and speech behind. He'd come back around dawn, his throat and his chest and his belly smeared with red, pushing in the back door and straightening up in the kitchen. Bones clicking, shoulders rolling into place, he'd say, "Why don't you ever come hunt with me, Ada?" And I'd laugh and remind him that I'd pleasures all my own. Isn't that cool? He'd go out on all four, hunting in the woods. Every morning when we were expecting a cure, he'd say, "You've a cure today, Ada," as if he needed to remind me, as if I'd ever once forgotten. I'd be kneeling in the grass, getting familiar with a cricket or a bird, and he'd call to me, just for the satisfaction it sometimes seemed of disrupting me. Cure today, cure today. This particular morning, it couldn't have been long after 6, but already the summer heat was settling in, and the sky wide and bleached, and the ground calling for rain. The garden is long and mostly grass, but back then, close to the house, we kept a patch of moist, fragrant soil that was as much ground as Father had managed to tame, and it was where we put cures that needed long, deep peeling. The easier ones we saw, too, in the house. The rest of the ground we didn't use for anything. It was too temperamental and kept to rules we couldn't follow. The burial patch let cures sleep their sickness away, and sped up stitch and suture, but the ground, the long, long lawn, it gorged on bodies, shaped them to its own liking. The ground is where Father and I were born. It appears randomly in all sorts of places, and so though Father was born in the ground, he was born somewhere else, somewhere far away. Inside the house, Father was bent over the stove, stewing a broth that had citrus smell. He was so tall and had to bend so deep. It often struck me he'd be better kneeling. His faded white shirt and his faded white pants gave his skin a sandy sparkle, and when it was hot enough to sweat, he glowed against the dull house and against the cracked porcelain and the faded pine and the rugs whose color looked like they'd been watered down. I nodded at the broth. Is that for Miss Levine? Claudie Levine was that day's cure. No, it's not for anyone. I'm trying something new. And Claudie Levine arrived at noon, and I sang her belly open, and sang her sickness away, and tricked it into a little bowl under the table, and closed her up again, woke her up again, told her she'd be sore in the morning, waved her away and down the drive, and poured her sickness down the drain, and then I went on to meet Samson. Such was the easy sing-song pattern of my days. Often a cure would say, "You probably don't remember me, but I'm such and such daughter." And we'd say, "Oh, yeah, oh, yes, we do, of course we do," while recalling some unspectacular mother or father, and they'd look at us long and wistful, hoping for some little glimmer of our private selves. We tried not to get too personal with cures, or let them see too many of our ways. They scared easily, and while they knew that we didn't eat and that we aged slow, they didn't know I stole the song out of Baby Birds, or that Father ran through the woods like a bear. And no, most cures frightened easy. That was part of the magic about Samson. I had been seeing Samson for what felt like a long time, mostly because I couldn't remember how I'd gotten by without him. He'd come to the house a few months before, looking to be cured of a sore on the roof of his mouth, and I almost laughed at the smallness of it. It seemed such a harmless nonsense thing to pay for, but he said it'd been there for weeks and with no sign of going away, and I didn't even need to put him asleep. Just made him rest his head back in the kitchen chair and sang a little tune into his open mouth, and I held his head and hooked my thumbs into his cheeks, and later he told me that was what did it. The sore came up on the wall behind him because I had been too lazy to fetch a cup or bowl. It puckered there, discoloring the paint, while he looked at me and said he liked the sound of my name. This is something cures don't know about their curing. The sickness isn't gone, it just goes elsewhere. That's so weird. This show, I love it, so out there. The sickness leaves your body, it shows up on the wall. It pops up somewhere else. It's weird. Sang a tune into his mouth. Late the day after, Annabelle Lennox arrived with 2 lungs full of fluid that couldn't be tended to while still inside her, so we took them out and put her to ground. First we laid her on the kitchen table and unbuttoned her dress, like she was already a corpse, and we meant to bathe. Her ribs had dark smudged shadows between them, like they had been whitewashed with paint, and the undercoat was starting to wear through. I was holding 2 hands over her face and singing, clucking whenever it looked like she might waken. Father opened her quickly, his large hand disappearing inside her with a papery sound. He studied the left lung and then the right, and she gasped coarsely, and when he lifted them out of her, he went to the pantry holding one in each hand. Their mucus trailed behind him, catching on corners, wispy, smoky. I heard him go out the patio door, and then saw him through the kitchen window digging. He came back in, wiping his hands on his shirt. All right. He lifted her and held her head so her neck didn't pull, slipping my fingers under her curls, soft, warm scalp. She looked much smaller, laid out in the hole Father had made for her. This was often the case. The juice of her innards still clung to Father's forearms with a slow, thick slime, and the mouth of the shovel caught the last of the evening light as he filled in the hole. Quick practice motion, the handle worn smooth. Where he gripped it, a light wind was rolling in, shaking the oleander and making the lamp over the patio door squeak. It was night all of a sudden, and I was tired. Miss Lennox's dress had turned the color of the damp ground. Now almost covered up, she started to kick a little, her bare heels scuffing at the walls of her shallow bedding. All this time I could hear her lungs rocking inside the pantry, a sound like a boat tied at a harbor. And when the hole was filled, Father walked across it in careful, even steps, pressing the soil down smooth. He was very particular when it came to digging. Is that scary? Imagine her kicking as they're putting the dirt on her. The whole thing is haunting. It's so unusual. It's hypnotic. Father started giving me slow drips of warning about the ground when I was only a few weeks old. If it takes you, there's not much you can do. Try not to squirm and keep one hand straight up in the air. If you go in over your head, try not to open your mouth and eyes. No matter how long you're there for, keep your face shut up tight. But you'll see me? I'll see you, and you'll get me right away. There's no reason for you to be in that part of the garden without me anyway, especially not before, during, or after rain. But we're from the ground. We are, and it would take us back if it could. It never took me, though, and I was out there for almost half of every day, trying to keep myself company. I'd no one like myself other than Father, who was always working, and I frightened the Cure children. First time I tried to lie down with a boy, I didn't know what I was doing, and I laid down and he laid down over me, and I held on tight, and he went to put it in, and there was nowhere for it to go, and he got scared and bit me right on the neck and left me with a toothy rosy ring, and my smock creased around my thighs, and ran back to the house and to his mother, who Father was busy curing. I looked up through the branches and tutted and wondered at the sweet hurt ache I know now to be what cures call lust and longing. By the time I took Samson inside, I'd grown myself an opening that I'd a dozen names for. The longing had come on strong enough by then, and so it appeared. My glove, my pucker, my pouch, and the first time was a week after I'd cured him. I'd been thinking about the soft fuzz on it's cute. Soft fuzz on his hair, on the back of his head, and the strong tendons run up his throat. And I was walking toward Sister Eel Lake, and the day was scalding, and the long grass at the side of the dirt road yellow and chafing, and all the trees wilting. Miss Ada, that you?" He parked his truck off the road, deep in shade, and I could see him leaning on the door, arm resting on the mirror at the driver's side. And I said, "What are you doing out here?" "What are you doing out here?" Knowing there was nothing between the Cure's village and our house, our home, he had on a white vest that had his sweat saw stick. He had a white vest that his sweat saw stick to him. I looked at his chest and its nest of hair and was leaning on the side of the truck, and now he laughed and rubbed at his hard taunt stomach, and I thought you might sing to me. We lay down in the open back of the truck, and he asked if there was much chance of hurting me. I only laughed when I took him inside, and I laughed again. It was that good a feeling. And so quickly we got into the habit of one another. Woo! I was in the bathroom. I was like, oh yeah. I didn't expect that kind of pretty though. I didn't expect that in this book. It was easy to forget Henry Law. It was easy to forget they're not like us. You could be looking at Miss Ada and talking to her. Simply, and then she'd say something like, "Take into account the evenings are getting long, Mr. Law," and her father too, and we'd be talking easily enough, and then all of a sudden I'd remember he knew my pop and all my uncles from the day they were born till the day they died. I suppose it was easy to forget because they made it easy. They had to get by. Live long. It's so spooky. Interesting. It's cool. It didn't matter to Father that most cures were cautious of us because he didn't care for company, and it didn't matter to him that a couple of the curings came local folklore and got told over and over, getting longer and stranger each time. Tabitha Sharp, for instance. She was a cure of mine from when I was very young, the first in the habit of going for walks near Sister Eel Lake. I'd play in the long pale grass, pulling it around myself and weaving a wheaten cradle, and I laced the stalks over one another into thick and clumsy plaits in the way that some cure women bound their hair and lay there for an hour or so, imagining myself an infant cure, helpless, speechless, pursing my mouth to signal I wanted my mother's teat. And Father told me that the cures remember nothing of being inside their mothers, which I thought strange. I remembered so clearly my time in the ground, and I remembered the closeness of the soil and the taste of rain come down toward me. Once the backs of my legs started itching, I kicked away the cradle, shredded its walls, tore it down. On the way home I played a game I often played when lazy with heat. It was a simple game. I'd look into Sister Eel Lake and convince myself I saw her there, whiskery, oily mouth, and so frighten myself into running all the way home. I squatted in the rustles and felt my dress peel away from my back and waiting to be taken by surprise. But then a noise, a real noise, a noise I hadn't spun in my head, a wet slipping sound and a pocket of air dispersing. There was a baby where there hadn't been one before, a baby wrapped in a bit of cloth torn from a sheet or a large man's shirt. The cloth was covered in stringy bits of blood and the baby was sickly. I lifted it into my lap and a small head rolled away, tiny throat, too tiny to cry, little pink disc for a face and the features slightly flattened, fair hair plastered down with mucus and blood. I checked it over and saw it was a girl. My first thought, some crazed parent had left her here for Sister Eel. Offerings were sometimes made to her by cures, who thought she could shimmy under the fields and make succulent the crops, though it was usually a calf or a fox they left for her. With my arms around the baby, I walked to the quarter-hour home, looking at her face, mouth like a berry still ripening, her eyelids so thin I could see through them. You know, I'm seeing through someone's eyelids, and then it just looks like you just see their eyes. Their eyes. That's weird. We'd no cures scheduled that day, and so I knew there'd be an accident when I saw the old van parked at a hard, quick angle to the house. A smell of wet was coming off the van, and a sucked penny smell. And once inside the house, it wafted thick and strong. I followed it upstairs, an ache starting in my arms with the weight of the baby. I could hear Father talking. They were in the third spare room, our best room, with its view of the garden's greenest part. There was a woman in a rocking chair. She was crying, mostly with pain, and there was a man crying with sadness behind her. Father was on his knees. He said, "You really mustn't move." And I'd never seen the woman before, but later learned her name, Miss Delilah Sharp. And she sat in the rocking chair, and her dress was rolled up to her waist, and she held her own knees very far apart, and Father was rolling a strip of torn sheet to pad at the softness between Miss Sharp's legs, and there was already a heap of used ones on the ground. And I clucked my tongue at the long chore ahead of me, washing the strips one by one, perhaps even stitching the sheet up again. Miss Sharp saw me, and Father turned around, and Miss Sharp lay back in the chair, her eyes closing, and the sun had gotten higher, and the day was pumping hot and cruel outside. And I found her at Sister Eel Lake. Father had come close to me, stopped when he could see the baby's wrinkled head. She seems heavier now that I was standing still, and squirmed while I did my best to rock her. Should I boil up some daisies? Which was a broth we made for damaged parts. Go give Miss Sharp her baby, Ada. By now Miss Sharp was trying to right herself in the chair, and Mr. Sharp was still crying but not making any sound. You do it. I held her up to Father, and he looked at me, stone-hard, slit-eyed. A scolding later, for sure. He took her from the sullied cloth and carried her to Miss Sharp, and when she reached across her risen stomach, more bright blood came out of her, and I heard its soft drip on the rug, and Mr. Sharp sat down on the floor, his back to the wall. They were a young couple and probably not married long. I stayed in the door, moving from one foot to the other, wringing out the cloth until I noticed the copper flecks on my hands, like I had been clutching a rusty pipe. And I'd best get this in the bath before the stains stick. But I was well forgotten by now. I don't know if Father even realized how this story spread in town. Cures couldn't grasp that a baby could leave its mother without being birthed, could wind up so far away and be discovered by me, as though plucked out of the air. It made more sense to them that I'd killed the Sharp baby and given her parents a changeling, a strange little creature like myself who would someday do my bidding. For years I wondered if it was my dream of a cradle that called her to me. This was better than thinking that Sister Eel Lake was simply where too soon babies go. Always when we met, he'd have some quick greeting ready. The third time we saw one another, the day after we put Miss Lennox to ground, he said, "You get on better with the heat." It was the first time I'd gotten into the front of the truck. The edges of the passenger seat were stained a deep brown, and he had cure music playing, and it seemed to gather speed. Ew. Speed as he turned corners and cast backward glances at the road by way of the little mirror between us. And the bottom of the window had the usual hillside pattern of dust thrown up by wheels and mist by wipers. We came to Sister Eel Lake, and he looked at me. "Keep driving." I was surprised he'd been willing to stop there. Almost everyone was cautious of the lake, and believed the story of cannibal serpents. Those giant gorging eels grown during the war to kill enemy soldiers who stopped to bathe and swim, and it was well known how they'd gone hungry some weeks into peacetime, and so began to swallow one another whole. And when only Sister and Brother Eel remained, they watched one another until Brother fell asleep, and it was his fear that shook me, his fear upon waking, thrashing in the right dark, that was his sister, engulfed even as he stirred from sleep. It was Sister Eel who had years ago eaten most of Christopher Plum, a slime and freckled child. When he was 9, Father worked on him a great deal, out of courtesy to the family. "Are you afraid of your father seeing us?" Driving under a willow tree, whose branches snagged around the windows. Father doesn't really leave the house. This was part of a lie we kept afloat. Cures could scare easy at Father's animal tendencies, blame him for livestock gone missing, though he never hunted anything that wasn't wild. We kept going and came to a wider, more I just love imagining a wild father and going out in like an animal in the night on all fours, hunting. Just everything. A baby rising out of the mud. It's just cool stuff. Wild things. We kept going and came to a wider, more unkempt corners, and I heard that. I didn't think it was true. He doesn't feel the need. We came through a brief density of trees, and the road straightened, but you do? I like the change in air. His thighs clenched inside his trousers. I looked out the window, said, "There's always a lot of smells in our house." He was swallowing from thirst. I stopped talking. We came to the river. "How about here?" He left the truck parked by a high bush, grown up straight and thick like a wall. We'd arrived by the main road, not the back paths I usually walk down. The trees on the river's far side, maybe 50 feet tall, and the branches reached out to criss and cross with their neighbors to make a cool, echo-filled chamber high in the air. I got out of the truck and shook out my dress and walked toward the reeds. I heard him following, making long grass crackle. I said, "I like the river. I've never seen you here." "Father doesn't like me to be seen outside the house." "Why's that?" "I suppose it's not so important now. It was more for when I was a child, and Cures weren't sure what to make of me." "Cures?" he laughed. "That's what you call us?" He was walking alongside me now, and I watched his vest catch at the top of his trousers, twisting and releasing with his long, high strides, and we reached We reached the shade, and it felt like stepping through a wall of water. I felt him looking at me, my smock hanging free of one shoulder, was clinging to my stomach, and the short, prickling hair of my groin. Were you really so strange? There were certain things about me, by which I meant my girlhood, constant and unceasing. A cure could live their whole lifespan and never notice a change in me. And so, to them, I seemed a girl of sorts forever. There wasn't a way I didn't want to. There wasn't a. I just love the way this is written. It's so sexy. It's so my type of sexy. This is the way I think. I feel. There wasn't a way I didn't want to swallow him whole. Not only up between my legs, but down my throat. And the feel of him moving over me, and our thighs skimming, our stomachs sealed tight. I'd opened up so many cures, but couldn't think what he had inside him that wouldn't let me build his fire in me. This tingling that built and built until I thought it'd tear me apart. Tell me about it. Couldn't think how I'd changed so much in so short a time that I wanted it so badly to be torn. Later we rested beside one another in the grass, and I kept looking up at the knotted branches and the thin slivers of blue where they let through the sky, and I touched his head, his soft curls. He was tired, half dreaming, and I was a long time in the desert, and he laughed at himself, but I knew what he meant. It was late at night 2 days later when we went out to fetch Miss Lennox. When the air hit her, she turned hummingbird, finger tap, tremble knee. Father carried her into the kitchen, and we laid her out again. It took time enough to open her, being stilled so long in the ground. The skin was all stiff and cold. She'll scar, I said, and Father nodded. I went to fetch the lungs. They rocked and swished slowly inside of the bowl, their mucus sticking to my fingers and wrists. It sometimes happened that the halted stillness worked into a cure, and their parts colored, and the air around them. It was generally went unnoticed by cures themselves, but it was possible to see on occasion a slight slowing of time, a wound appearing in some soft flesh, but not coloring with blood. This was why the skin of Miss Lennox's lungs took its time in rising, and its time in falling. Where it touched me, it left behind a cringing, grisly sensation. The night was cool, but Father's chest was shining with sweat. Lungs were always tricky. Her insides were filling the room with a sound of water, a lake lapping against its edges, shifting the pebble and grit. I handed Father the first lung, and after he'd placed it inside her, I did the detail work, the work his hands were too big for, stopping and making seamless frayed holes and cords, undoing as best I could all the strangeness her thin body had seen. The second lung took quicker, squirming from Father's hand and filling the space it had left behind. We closed her and then bathed the blood away, and Father woke her. Her mother arrived to collect her as 3:15 in the morning, as she'd been told. 3:15 in the morning. Such a weird time. As she'd been told, Father walked Miss Lennox out to the car, and I stood in the door. letting the night-time cool settle around me. They drove off, and the car was an old one, and sputtered and coughed, and the headlamps were covered with dust from the road, and gave off only a little light, and Father was walking his slow gait from the middle of the drive. He said, "Time for bed now, Ada. Might sleep late in the morning." And then he walked past me, his arms grazing mine, and I kept on looking out at the night, and the moonshine was making silver the top of a tree that kept rustling, and on off with the red-tailed hawk that nested there. There are some technical terms about curing. Declension? Occultate? Father made me learn them, but we never used them, not even to one another. I think teaching them to me was just another way to fill up the days. He wrote poems for me which worked better, small simple verses to help me understand the work we did. Lest you tumble, slip, or trip, hold firm, not tight, and lift with both hands, however light. I'd murmur them aloud while pulling weeds from the ground and scrubbing strips of linen, but it took me a long time to fathom the long line of ailments ahead of me. It's past where I've read now, so I don't know how much further I'll go. I just wanted to give a nice taste. Chafed skin and chalky bones, two thin veins and two large hearts. Every now and then Samson would talk about his sister, the recently widowed Olivia, how they'd grown up in a small room in their aunt's house, and how Olivia hated what she called the poverty, hated the whole town, and when we were little she thought the only way she'd escape was the circus. But then she started meeting men, and then she met Harry. But then Harry's house was so big, and I don't think she knew what to do with all the different rooms, and he was sitting under a tree, shirtless in the shade, watching me wade in the river for something to say. I said, Harry was much older than her, and I had cured him one time for a bitter bile in his stomach. She wanted to get married quick before she had to work. She wouldn't last a day in the fields. And what does she do with the rooms now that he's died? He made a noise. And what does she do with the rooms now that he's died? He made a noise in his throat. His parents kicked her out, so she's living with me again. Which was their aunt's house, the house they'd grown up in with their aunt, had left to Samson when she died. I knelt in the water, it came up to my shoulders, slipped under my hair. Do you have the space? Hardly. We're back sharing a bed, like when we were children, see? And he turned around, showed me where her knees had left bruises down his back. Sometimes we didn't go to the river, but into the woods, deep into Sometimes we didn't go to the river, but into the woods, deep into the middle, where the branches gathered in knots, and hid us from the hot blue sky, and it needed constant tending. Samson's skin, the sun, might be singing. Samson's want of shelter, Samson's want of cool. Often when it came time to lie down together, he'd already be pink and dazed, weighted down by the sun, and I caught myself at such times thinking how it'd take to open him, to be inside him, and to see how compact, how snug, and how sound the mechanisms therein. A warm sweep across my pelvic floor, a long exhale down my spine, a heat kept just off the boil. I had stomach problems, you see. Leela Gideo. I've stomach problems, you see. That and tightness in the chest come springtime. The pollen. Yes, the pollen. It seems to stick to my throat. So I was always up there when I was young. Can't count how many times I was put to ground. All that soil, and it was a different kind of soil. It never quite came out in the wash. But I didn't mind. Of course I didn't mind. I was just happy to have been made well. And whether it was my stomach or my lungs or one of my headaches, I get desperate headaches too. We've a man now that comes around the houses since Miss Ada stopped curing. He comes around with his bag of tricks, and oh, it just isn't the same. She loves going in the ground, getting healed, getting buried, and getting healed up. I don't know, maybe I'll crop this. I don't know if, because now it's like just turning into the. I feel like we went past the intro. I just want to share the intro. I'll just keep reading until I get sick of it. And I don't know. Maybe I'll crop it, maybe I won't. When Mr. Knott came to see us, his neck was all bruised. Father said he must have been kneading himself, trying to loosen the knot at the base of his skull from his cerebellum growing twisted and hard. Cerebellum, cerebellum, edible sounding, the name's itself full of swell, apparently supple when healthy. We put him to sleep in the sitting room and then rolled him face down on the couch, and I held his thumb in my hand. He was the only man I'd ever seen of similar size to Father, though even as he lay still in the afternoon light, I could see him shedding flake after flake of skin, and while all Father ever parted with was the mark of his mouth on his mug, maybe the fleeting indent of his hand on a cure, we'd opened him just enough to spy the withered partial organ. There's not that much to be done. This hard grid of muscle, we could bring that down. The problem is deeper, something we can't fix. Why can't we fix it? Because sick is sick, and it has to go somewhere, and some sicknesses are dangerous when taken out of a body. By which he meant madness and perversion. Seeing as he let Mr. Colt in the house, I assumed it was madness, maybe the glitching memory or the many voices kind. And sometimes, even though it's harmful, if a sickness has been deep set too long, a body doesn't think to expel it. How'd you mean? It takes a toll on the flesh. It's leaving. I looked at him blank, though it irked him when I didn't catch his meaning right away. He looked from me back to Mr. Colt's sore neck and said, I mean, if it's left untended too long, the body can't live without it. Sitting back on my ankles, I imagined a small lamb coming into the room and trying to suckle on me, moving its rough tongue from left to right. At first I didn't know why, but then I remembered Mr. Colt's cousin, Lorraine Langwood, some 15 or so years before. It was the only time Father and I... There's something, in the last 3 books, or whatever, something with this book, we've always lived in a castle, the trees crept in, there's something about the way, the language, they all feel similar to me a little bit. I can't explain it. It makes me feel like it reminds me of the same. Well, maybe not. Yeah, no. Maybe not. There's something similar though. I can't I don't know what it is. It's like something like, it's not nothing I know. This person it's somebody, it feels like the same person somehow. It has the same tone, there's a similar tone. But it ain't nothing, I don't know this person. It's nobody I know. I can't, so I don't like it, but they all feel like the same person. I can't explain it. Just this, whatever. Nobody knows what I'm talking about. It was the only time Father and I had together left the house to the farm where Mr. Langwood lived, with his wife and sons. Lorraine Langwood was a young woman still, and was slowly finishing being a child. Father made the rare exception to tend to a cure in his own home, and to distract herself, Lorraine took me to the barn. The lambs were there, and the hay was all slick with their pursing mouths, and I remember Lorraine tried to hold my hand, and I'd made it into a fist and tried to shake away the feel of her holding it. That curing had been a strong one. It gave Mr. Langwood another 5 years. I mean, they're not the same, but there's something in the way the writing style is. The not really. I can't sing. Nobody knows. I'm sorry. It just makes me feel like I'm gonna have to crop it. I'll change position. Maybe it feels like someone back east, or somebody, or someone in another country. Maybe it's because the girl feels the same in all of them. I don't even know. The character of the girl always feels the same. Just like almost like a slithering creature of a girl. Just like like bliss. Like, that's also the world is a weird place. She's weird. Everyone's weird. That tone. That's what it is. She's weird and everyone's weird, and she's just a thing of the earth and weird, doesn't belong, and I think that's what it is. I can identify with that. Maybe I'm not cool. Maybe I'm not in that cool of a way, I guess. It was the only time Father and I had together left the house to the farm where Mr. Langwood lived, with his wife and sons. Lorraine Langwood. was a young was oh was a young woman still, and was slowly finishing being a child. Father had made the rare exception to tend to cure in his own home, and to distract herself, Lorraine took me to the barn. The lambs were there, and the hay was all slick with their pursing mouths, and I remember Lorraine tried to hold my hand, and I'd made it into a fist and tried to shake the feel of her holding it. That curing had been a strong one. It gave Mr. Langwood another 5 years, at which point his heart would again make that smacking sound, but he'd be far away and not found until the bonnet of his truck had cooled. And Father was at his strongest then. Even his mildest touch did a lot of good. We needed Mr. Carlton, then we hummed and sang, and when we opened him fully and lifted out the cerebellum, it made a harsh coughing sound, and his mouth had leaked its moisture into the sitting room couch, bringing the old pink cushion up in the soft mauve bruise. If it were to try and fix the deep brown sickness, what might we do? If we try to fix the deep brown sickness, what might we do? Father shrugged. Bleed him, and keep him hidden from the moon. But when a sickness like that leaves, the body, there's no telling where it will go. He was quiet a moment, looking at this large man that couldn't be saved. No. If we were risk takers, we might put him to the ground, but there's no way to know for sure what it would do. It might cure him, not quite. The ground flips things around. Either way, he wouldn't be a cure anymore. He'd become more like us. He couldn't heal, but he'd be different. On the inside, we put Mr. Colt into the ground, to the left and farthest corner from the house. We knew he would kick, and he did. His thighs were broad, a horse hind leg. Back in the house, I listened for the sound of his grave breaking, but it didn't come. I went to bed thinking hard on Samson and hoping to sow the seeds of a dream, his stomach coming undone, a wide mouth tasting the air, a silver spreading up the center of his almond-shelled chest. I waited to dream of his heart, its beat sullen and low. His heart that was a crimson heart, not the pastel shades of other cures. Snug in my hand, his quadrant muscle, feeling it beat against my palm. But when I closed my eyes, all I could think of was the lambs. The look of the lambs in their mouths, the smell of the barn, Lorraine Langwood leaning in the doorway, putting something in her mouth, a cigarette. Though I didn't know what it was at the time, I thought the smoke was coming from her. I thought her mouth was on fire. It's interesting. It's cool. That's real cool. The next morning I went to meet Samson. When I got there, he was tanning in the back of his truck, his shirt off and his jeans hanging unevenly around his hips. I love all the descriptions of the guy. I can just see it. I feel, I, I just feel it. I just see it all zoomed in. Just like a thing. Just like, just like a. I feel it feels just relatable. I just feel like it's just we just see this girl creeping, just staring at this boy. The way his pants rise on his body, and the way his skin glows in the sun or whatever. I did. Oh, it's hot. It's cute. I feel it. I see it. I know it. Oh. His shirt off and his jeans hanging unevenly around his hips from where he'd pulled the hot buckle away from his skin, and I whistled to wake him and climb into the truck. And maybe she's not thinking that. Maybe she's just giving a description, and I'm just turning it into something more. Maybe I just think it's hot. Maybe I'm doing it. If you wake him up and climbed into the truck, he scrunched his eyes at me and said, "Must really be summer if you're starting to freckle." And we got into the front, started driving toward the river, and he coughed and looked at my thighs. Ooh. "You know, I've been hearing about you since I was a boy. A small insect was scalding. I've been hearing about you since I was a boy. A small insect was scaling the window as we drove. On my side of the glass, I followed his trail with my finger, clucking at the thinness of its legs." What's this clucking? So, like this. There was a lot of fuss at the time over Tabitha Sharp. Why the Sharps ever told anyone about how Tabitha came into the world, I could never fathom. That girl hasn't the easiest time of it. She was stripped down once. Kids looking for teeth marks from Sister Eel. They waited for me to say something. When I didn't, he said, "Anyway, she was never quite right. It wasn't the first time I'd heard this kind of talk about Tabitha. Could be I found her too late. Could be too much of the lake was already inside her." The insect stripped of its grip as Samson took a corner. Too sharply, was gone from the window. He kept talking. "You ever see her? Tabitha Sharp?" "No." "Sister Eel?" "No." Running my hand up the back of my neck, sliding it into my hair, then remembering myself. "Have you?" "No." Adjusting himself in the seat, trying to lessen contact with the sweating leather. "But Olivia and I, we used to play a game if we were ever near the lake, which was when their parents were in the fields, before their parents died, before they went to live with their aunt and slept together in the small creaking bed. We'd come to the river. Samson turned the key to make the engine hush, and then hunched toward the steering wheel. His vest had left a glistening copy of itself behind, so that his skin was shining where the droplets sat on his body, thick as tears. And we'd pretended that we were brother and sister eel, and Olivia would chase me, trying to eat me." His eyes closed. I looked at the cloth of my dress sticking to me. I lifted it and watched it fall, landing against with a twirl. "One day we ended up on opposite sides of the lake. Olivia was jumping up and down, saying, "I'm gonna catch you and I'm gonna eat you." And he swallowed and it made a loud clicking sound, and he closed his eyes tighter and the skin of his brow bunched towards his eyes. I was ducked down in the rushes and I heard a splash and thought Olivia had fallen in. And I saw the spray of water from the ground. He laughed to himself and said, "Some of it landed in my mouth. I thought I'd die." Opening his eyes, moving again to his seat. "So you went looking for Olivia?" "Yes." He was tense now, like he was bracing against a chill. "I found her, and she was standing with her hands in her pockets." Come on. She was standing with her hands in her pockets, rubbing her feet in the dirt, and she'd seen one of the humps. Oh, this is a delight. Hello. "I found her. She was standing with her hands in her pockets, rubbing her feet in the dirt. Said she'd seen one of the humps breaking up the water. And then the tail. The tail looked mad, she said. It was the tail that had made the splash." His eyes were on my knees. Already I felt the scratch of the gorse and the grass we'd walked through. And Olivia wasn't afraid? He laughed, moving quickly now, opening the door and swinging his legs outside. "Olivia doesn't get afraid, not even as a child, not even of Sister Eel." Olivia was never really a child, turning back to wink at me. "Kind of the opposite to you." And then we were wading through the waist-high grass, and his hands were on me like warm water. While I opened, spread around him and held on to him. Ooh, while I opened and spread around him and held on to him. Whenever he was inside me, I turned to a fist, grasping and releasing. A fist learning the shape of the thing it's holding. Ooh la la. So hot. Tabitha Sharp. Only time I met her was when I was born. Only time I met her was when I was born. Nothing wrong with me my whole life, lest you come my red dust haze. I see red when it rains, and when I look at any kind of water, a river or a lake or a stream, red, red, red. And when people go swimming or stand out in the rain, afterward they're all dripping red. I didn't realize water wasn't red for everyone else till I was 10 and Mother was reading to me from a picture book, and I asked her why the rain in the book wasn't red, and she was frightened, and she kept her fear on the inside like Father can never do, and just asked me what else was red, and I pointed at her red mouth and her red shoes, and that seemed to calm her. And we never go swimming in the summer, though, and I'm only allowed quick showers, never a bath, and Mother pulls the curtains every time it rains. Ew. Like I said, I was young when Father started feeding me stories and warnings about the ground. The ground is cruel, but with tilling and culling we can make it useful. sitting at the kitchen table, flicking my tongue against the back of my teeth. Why only such a small part of the burial? Small part for the burial. My father and I worked a long time on taming it, just so that the ground would cushion a body and yield it again. Only a small patch can be handled at a time. It takes huge strength. When you are older, we will try to rein in some more, and then when you have a child, you'll try for more again. And we don't live here to fix Martha Jacobs. Miss Jacobs was the pale wisp of a cure he had seen to that day. No, Ada, had Miss Jacobs lived in a different town, she would have gone unfixed. It's about to rain. A high wind came through the trees a half-mile away, and I could see the dust on the road shooting up a foot high. Samson said, "We're due a storm. We're due a storm. We're due a storm." I was sitting against a tree and he was lying on his shirt. Olivia can always tell when the rain is coming. That's right. Cures often believed themselves a little bit magic. It got tiresome. From the smell and the rain, sometimes as far as 2 days away. Can you imagine that? Say you lived longer than all these people. So they just probably just seem like just little fleeting things, little fleeting creatures. Like this. Oh, I could tell when a storm's coming. I was like, yeah, I've been alive longer than you. I've seen before you. Why? You know, maybe they do. Maybe she do. Maybe he do. That's a funny thought, though. She used to love playing in the rain when we were little, and when all the other kids would run inside, and I looked at my feet and I looked at Samson's calves, and the left one marked by one long thin scratch that was filled with wet dry red. It moved through his fine blonde hair with a serpentine twist. Anyway, she can tell you about that herself. I stretched out my own legs, started thinking about my walk home, and when would I meet her? She's having a baby. Didn't I tell you? I looked at his face, the side of it not hidden by his arm. No, your sister's pregnant. She'll be giving birth soon. He sat up then quickly, almost knocking me aside. I pulled my dress toward me while he squatted in the shade, his buttocks made pink and crimson by the brittle twig shards on the ground. By now it was raining, though. It barely made it through the mesh of the trees, landing every now and then on the hot ground with a careful tutting sound. So she was pregnant when Harry died. You can do the math as well as me. His elbows cut their way through his vest as he pulled it back over his head. I stood up and headed for the road. "All right," I said. "See you." "All right, see you." By the time I got home, the sky had hazardous silver sheen. I stopped on the bottom steps to smell the air. It had that rubbery, skidding wheel scent that always preceded a storm. And I was wet from the rain, and the cool felt good to me. And Father was in the sitting room, staring at the angle between the ceiling and the far wall. A mug held in one cupped hand. I said, "Thick rain coming." This was something we always said when a strong wind came before rain. Already I could hear the branches tossing themselves against the house and the shutters rattling in their cases. Father would most likely need to turn up his sleeves and see to the leak in the bathroom ceiling. The paint there flaked and yellowing garners a slippery shine in the rain. He was a strange sight in the bathroom. It's a low-ceilinged room, and the top of his head grazed the door frame. But just now the storm was still cloud-bound, and Father's last swill of coffee was losing its grainy scent. We went to the kitchen. I didn't speak. I was tired, and my eyes felt large and unruly in my head, and he was talking about our next cure. Lilia Guidio. Lilia Guidio. A woman we'd often seen too, who'd be coming again soon. He was moving around the countertop, setting the hob alight with its rim of fire blue. What's wrong with her this time? He kept his back to me. The creases in his shirt were moving like tiny panicked worms. He was cooking something on the floor by the table. I saw our laundry in the bucket, the linen scrubbed coarse. I sat down and pulled it toward me, started rubbing them off one another, coaxing up suds. I looked up. Father? He shook the pan. A smell of rust and lilac filled the room. Where do you go when you go out during the day? My dress was sticking to me now. Since when does it matter? Are you meeting a boy? A man? Do I ask what you do in the woods? Ask whatever you like. I'd rather do the courteous thing and leave you be. I know you meet someone. My hands quickly turning raw and pink. I dropped the linens in the water and went outside. Out back and onto the burial patch where the weather would stop me hearing him. Before I closed the patio door behind me, he called, "You've a cure tomorrow, Olivia Claudette." Oh, Daddy. Oh, Daddy. Arson Bill. I don't know, is that a girl or boy? No one was quite sure what they could and couldn't do. A lot of people thought they could read minds. Others thought they could see the future. All that kind of thing. I just went there and asked them to put me straight out, and I always said, "Do whatever you need to and tell me about it later." Once, though, he gave me a look like he knew something. After I'd done something I wasn't supposed to. I could say it now. It happened so long ago. I was a young man, didn't know better, and we didn't have many ways to pass the time. But a few days later I went to get fixed, and he looked at me so long and hard I thought he might hit me. Usually the two of them saw to me, but that time he told Ada to go play. Told her it was too nice a day to be stuck inside. Oh. I think I gave that man too jolly of a voice. He knew I did. The tone of that was too nonchalant. He did a bad thing. He was a bad boy, and Daddy knew it. The night Father went out hunting, That night father went out hunting. In the kitchen come evening, he started stirring inside of his clothes. Things were tense between us, but I said, "You go on, I could finish here." His features suddenly softened with relief, rolling his shirt. Things were tense between us, but I said, "You go. You go, I could finish here." His features suddenly softened with relief, rolling his shirt off his back like it was burning him. Extra length and bend that came into his ankles and wrists always looked like it would pain him. The arch in his hips, his shoulders broadening apart. If it did, he didn't say. When he came back in the morning, he had cut down the length of his back. Once he straightened upright again, he asked me to dab it with salt, and he was too sore to sit down, so I had to stand on a chair to reach the top of him. Wow, he's really tall. I had a sore in my throat. I woke up with it. I don't know why it got there. So with my black feet and my sore throat, and I feel weird and fragile in the night. It's like there's like missing time, like something's happening to me. Maybe when I'm sleeping, I'm waking up, and somewhere things are happening. That's why I'm always so tired. There's an interesting concept. Keep following. I'm happy that to be reading again. I feel like it's good. It's just what I need. This is just what I need. Because I feel like my personality has become very strange. I just become a bit weird. So this kind of makes me straighten out and look takes the weird quirk out of my voice and and the shyness of the things that are real to me. It just makes me just have to just look at things like just in a normal way. And I think I need that. Because I'm just a weirdo. And when I read, I go, oh, okay. I'm still norm. That I could still turn a normal. I could still become a normal person. I could. Does that make sense? I could still turn normal. Or go into a normal thinking. I could still escape normally. Into a normal. I could still escape into a norm. My normal person to process things. Or I don't know what I'm saying. Never mind. See what I mean? See, this is look at my. This is now I'm going in. Now I'm becoming my normal self. Going. That person isn't good. I just keep reading and reading. I just don't. I could just keep going. I don't know if I don't know if it's a good thing to do though. Because if this is a good book, I think you should buy the book. I don't want to just like read all my books and then somebody wouldn't go buy it. But then some people don't read, so maybe you'd like to hear it read. But look, it probably wants you to buy her book. She probably wants you to go buy it. She's pretty hot. Looks like she's like, don't, like, I don't know, she looks scary, I'm afraid. She's mad that she's beautiful and scary. I don't want her to be mad at me for even reading this much. So maybe go buy the book. I'm very excited to be reading it. I love the idea. I think it's so cool. I'll make another video with just some spoilers, I guess. Maybe if anything really sticks out in a way that excites me. So we ended on page 47, if anyone wants to continue from there. We ended with her standing on a chair and dabbing a wound on Father's back. From him being out hunting all night. On all fours. Alright. I'll see you later then. Thanks for listening. Isn't it cool?